I think we need more such intermixing of sessions between different schools. So I think that's where, probably one of our core competencies could be vis-a-vis standalone institutes. As a university, we should definitely leverage the various skills that we have across schools. Okay, so the mandate that Mr. Shah had given me was assessment of learning outcomes. So I will straight away jump into what are the learning outcomes and how I'm trying to assess them, in my course. So the course that I'm going to talk about is the course that I took this semester on Blue Ocean Strategy. This course was 1.5 credits with a classroom contact hours of 22.5 hours, and the duration was 1 slot. So in B school we have a slot system where we divide the semester into 2 slots. So it could be a semester-wide course or a slot-wise course depending on the requirement. So this was a 6-week 1 slot course. So the learning outcomes, as I was referring to earlier, are at 2 levels for a course. One is the program level learning outcomes and the other is the subject level learning outcomes. So the program level learning outcomes would be, let's say, at an MBA level or at an integrated BBA MBA level, and these outcomes are common for all the courses in that particular program. Okay, and we look at what some of these outcomes are. The next level is obviously the subject level learning outcomes, wherein I'm looking at this particular subject of Blue Ocean Strategy and I'm looking at what are the learning outcomes for this particular course. At a program level, which are common across all the courses in this program, are the 4 learning outcomes. So the LP1 and LP2, I've coded it this way. So L obviously is a learning outcome, P for a program. LP1 would be critical and integrative thinking. So by that, in a management discipline, we are looking at are students able to critically analyze a situation from all angles. And integrative obviously would be using all the concepts in a particular course. For a course like strategy, it has spatial relevance, because for a strategy they are also looking at different functions of an organization, be it marketing, accounting, finance, and trying to sort of look at all the angles. So that way this integrative thinking has added relevance for a course in strategic domain. LP2 is interpersonal awareness and working in teams. So I'm looking at what is their skill to actually be a team worker. Which sometimes loses its significance. Many people, especially management grads, write in their CV that they are a team worker without actually realizing that how much pain it takes to actually be a good team worker. And therein, in this particular learning, we are trying to assess how good team player that particular candidate is. LP3 is awareness of global issues affecting an organization's strategic decisions. And I'm looking at, because this being a global school and a global university, we're looking at what are the global issues that affect and how they affect, a particular organization and the decisions it takes. So here I'm assessing a candidate's ability to be able to analyze all these global issues, what are the relevant global issues, and how it affects the decisions, for that particular organization, that particular context. LP4 is effective presentation skills. Again, I'm looking at, in this particular learning outcome, how good presenter a particular candidate is. And we look at how I'm trying to assess it in different contexts. So these are the program level learning outcomes. We have 4 of them. Coming to the subject level learning outcomes. So for a Blue Ocean Strategy course, I have specifically 4 learning outcomes. And I've coded them LS1 as being subject. Okay, so LS1 would be a thorough understanding of an alternative yet complementary strategy paradigm. Now this is very strategy specific, so I wouldn't go too much detail into it, what exactly it is, but I'm trying to understand if they have a broad level understanding of what this alternative strategy paradigm is all about. LS2 would be key insights on the Blue Ocean concepts and frameworks. So I'm looking at the subject level frameworks and what is their students' understanding of all these different frameworks, theoretically speaking, right? So that is LS2. LS3 is application of these frameworks in real life-like situations. And I'm looking at not the knowledge, in addition to the knowledge of the frameworks, I'm looking at are they able to apply these frameworks in real life-like situations. And I'll talk about what these situations are for this particular course. LS4 is use of business simulation. So in this course, I also use a business simulation wherein basically the class is divided into different groups, and they are, they enter in a, they play a computer game wherein they are simulating this real work, real life-like situation, and they are competing with each other for revenues, for market share, for all the different things. So this is a business simulation that they play, and this is so the idea is they are aware of such a pedagogy, and they are able and they are comfortable to play such a simulation game, because this happens to be fairly common across the good B schools across the world. So in terms of mapping, I have 8 learning outcomes, 4 at the program level and 4 at the subject level. And I'm trying to say that this particular closed blue ocean strategy touches upon and assesses, all these different learning outcomes. So this is mandated by the accreditation bodies, in our case primarily ACBSP, AACSB, of course NAC. And we're trying to say that this is how we're doing it. So it's very well laid out and very quantitative to a large extent. In terms of teaching map, in terms of pedagogy, I'll just quickly touch upon it. So I use lectures in some of the courses. I use case studies. Case study in a business context would be, that Shonai also referred to, is a 20, 30, 10, 40 pages case about a company, and it simulates a business situation so that when the students read it, they're able to appreciate the different nuances a particular protagonist faces in real world. And students, of course, in your case, like, it would be a film. In our case, primarily it's a case study. So I mandate that these students read it, print it in hard copy. I need to see yellow marks all around, highlights, comments across the different case. Okay, and this is, made clear in the very first class. Okay, if some student comes without a hard copy of the case, he says, I've read the case, I show him the door. Okay, if the student comes with a hard copy of the case without reading the case, I show him or her the door. Okay, if the student has read the case, has the hard copy of the case, is able to actively engage in class, then he can stay in the class. Okay, otherwise he loses attendance, he loses class participation marks, and perhaps even more. So the consequences are very clear. So the students, what they do is normally, let's say in a class I have 15 cases. So most of the students print all of them in one go, make a spiral out of it, bring that spiral every day. So, and they read it and they know. So that cause and effect needs to be very clear, the consequences needs to be very clear, and I think students then tend to sort of follow it. A class-based discussion would be a pedagogy wherein, in a case, if there is a case, what I do in the class is I go and I don't speak more than, let's say, 15, 20, 25 sentences. That is it in a class. And all the discussion, basically, the students do. And they discuss a particular point, and the learnings come out of that discussion. Okay, so I am more of a facilitator rather than a moderator, rather than a lecturer. Okay, so this is that pedagogy. Then there are class-based exercises, something I was referring to with Kathleen as well, and the idea of, making the learnings, achieving the learning outcomes through other means. And sometimes what happens is if he's doing cases every class, they tend to get bored. As humans, we get bored. I mean, let's face it. And their attention spans, more and more research says that it's coming down. And another important thing that Shonai also referred to is the kind of audience that we get here is a different audience that we get at Harvard, for example, in my context, or in his context, some Cornell or wherever, right? So that's a slightly different audience. And the sooner we realize, better it is. So what I'm trying to say is that we need to sort of change the pedagogies or modify the pedagogies to achieve the same learning. I'm not saying dilute the learning outcomes, absolutely not. But try to sort of find a different, and that means a lot of work. Okay, it's not easy at all. It's quite difficult to actually try to find. But then that's what we got to do. Okay, so class-based exercises, role plays is something that I do in class. So sometimes they're simulating a real life situation, not through a case study, but through role plays. So someone is the VP of marketing, someone is the VP of manufacturing. There is a dilemma in the case, they discuss that dilemma. And the learnings come out of that. Everyone watches and sees, okay, this is actually how a human would behave in that situation. Because sometimes, let's say in a hypothetical context, there are organization goals, there are individual goals. Almost always the individual goals trump the organization goals at some point of time. And then you realize the tension between the two. Okay, so that's what I'm doing. So, you're using there. A business simulation would be a computer simulation which my students play often, and these guys, what they're doing is I divide them into teams. So big class, I have a class of 100 students as well. So I divided them into 2 sections, and then every section is also divided into different teams. And all these teams are competing with each other for market share, for revenues, for everything through a business simulation. Okay? From the point that they name the company, okay, they start a new company in a virtual world, of course. They name it, they open a LinkedIn profile of that company, and it's very real, right? And then they launch their first product. They make modifications, they're designing advertising, they're designing marketing, they're designing human resources, they're deciding what level to pay the employees, the productivity is going up and down, and they can see the whole cause and effect relationship. So that's a business simulation. T5 is a guest lecture for this particular course. I did not have a guest lecture. And T6 would be industrial visit, where I take these students to an industry to sort of experience it in real time. So that also is not here. So, but this is a teaching map that I have for every course that I teach. Now comes the assessment part. For this particular course, I have 5 different kind of assessments for a 1.5 credit course. Assignment 1 would be 10 marks. This is a group assignment, for example. And I'm giving them a situation, and as a group, they do something. So this is an assignment wherein one particular group gets the same marks. Okay, all of them get the same marks. Okay. Assignment 2 would be a quiz, for example, and that also is 10 marks for this particular course. This is strictly individual. So this is individually done, individually scored and marked. A3 is class participation, 20 marks, strictly individual. So what happens is every class, if there is a case or whatever, okay, after the class is over, I go back to my office. The first thing I do is I try to remember who answered what and mark those students, okay? So if a student gets a very good answer, because my memory is still fresh, so the very first thing that I do after going to the office is I say, okay, this student +1, +1, +1, +1, okay? And that's how students get marked there. A4 is the project work, which is individual and group. So what I mean by that is the students are marked as a team, but in every team to check free riding, and that comes very often in a group of 5 members. Let's say 3 are working, 1 is kind of working, and the last guy is not working at all. Okay, and is trying to free ride on someone else as well. So what I try to do is I give them some marks for the team that they are in, and then they are also individually done. So this is basically done by taking a viva and questioning them for every group presentation that they make. So these students are questioned individually to make sure that they actually understand what they're presenting. So if a group gets, let's say, 27 marks out of 30, okay, 2 students might get 27, 1 student might get 24, 1 student might get 5, because he doesn't know anything about what I mean, which is not possible if Hadi obviously contributed in that. And then finally, in this particular, the 5th assessment is a simulation for 30 marks. Again, in this particular video, that virtual simulation that they play, depending on their rankings, how much market share, and depending on whatever criteria it is, okay, the team gets marked. This is strictly group-based, so there is no individual marking here. Primarily the reason being I don't know exactly who contributed what. There is no way I would know. So hence, all the groups or one particular group, all the members get same marks. So this is the assessment criteria. Now the key thing here is to link this assessment to the learning outcomes. Okay, and that's where the real issue is. And that's where the accreditation body is actually looking for how you actually assessing these learning outcomes. So you have 8 learning outcomes and you have 5 different assessments, and how you're trying to link that. So the first thing I do is learning outcomes and assessment mapping. So for every learning outcome, what are the different assessments that are mapping that particular learning outcome? So for example, for LP1, which is critical and integrative thinking, okay, and I'm trying to assess this particular learning outcome, I'm saying all my assessments, measure this particular component. Because whether it's a quiz, or it's a class participation, or it's a business simulation, these guys are thinking critically, because otherwise they can't score. Okay, so and this integrative thinking, they're thinking about how the different frameworks are linked together. So on a whole, all these assessments measure this particular learning outcome. Okay, and this is very clear. The mapping is fairly clear. Now, when I say a number for a particular assessment, this is something that I do individually and it's not very clear at a school level. We still have, I think, some understanding to happen at a school level exactly how this is being to be done. Because, for example, if it's A2 would be a quiz, okay? And a quiz, if I'm taking, let's say 20 questions and I'm asking them 20 questions and they get marked on those 20 questions, right? I don't know exactly how much of it actually came from a critical and integrative thinking. So what they obviously are doing some critical thinking in order to answer those questions, okay? But I don't know exactly how to give marks to this particular component. And hence, A2 is kind of blank, so I don't know exactly how many marks do I associate for A2 for this particular learning outcome, but I do know that this is happening, and this is fairly clear. Okay, the rationale is clear, the quantum of marks is not clear, and hence that's why this is empty right now. But otherwise, A1, there is 2 marks, and I'll show you, what I mean by that. For LP2, interpersonal awareness, working in teams, there are only 3 assessments that measure this particular learning outcome. So A1 is, I think I have a cheat sheet here, so I'll just quickly sort of. Bracket is, I'm saying that if A1 is an assignment, it's a group assignment for 10 marks, 1 mark for that 10 marks is actually coming from interpersonal working in teams. So I'm marking them that way, and this is very clear because I marked them, right? But if I'm talking about A5, which is simulation, in simulation they get marks depending on which rank their team is, okay? So in that particular case, I do know that obviously they worked in teams because it's a teamwork, but I do not exactly know what component is actually, I should subtract. So I don't know the number I should put there, but I do know that this component has happened, and hence this is blank, okay? A4 would be project work, and again it's a group project work, so obviously some working teams obviously happen because it's a group project, okay? A2 is not there, which is individual quiz, and hence there was no score for teamwork, I hope, and I made sure that there was no teamwork in an individual quiz, okay? And what is also not there is class participation, which is also individual. So hence those 2 components are not there, but otherwise the 3 components are there. So I'm assessing this particular learning outcome through these assessments. LP3 would be awareness of global issues affecting organizations. Now these are all program level outcomes and common for all the courses. So awareness of global issues affecting strategic direction, again I'm saying A1, A3, A4, assess this particular learning outcome. Effective presentation skills, obviously I'm assessing this through A4, which is project work, and they're required to present this in front of me, and then I question them individually. Obviously, they are doing it through class participation, because when they're presenting in the class, for a particular case, I ask the question they're presenting, so I'm also sort of assessing the presentation skills. And it's also happening through A1, which is an assignment, because this also they present in front of the class. Okay? So A1, again, is a group presentation, and they're required to present it. So through these components, I'm assessing this particular learning outcome. Okay? Now, I've not put a number again because I don't know the quantum, and it's not very clear. Okay, but otherwise I do know that the presentation is obviously skill is required, and that's how I'm assessing it. At a subject level outcome, for example, LS1, this is the very first learning outcome. It's a thorough understanding of an alternative complementary strategy paradigm. We need not understand what exactly this is, but this is the first subject level outcome, and I'm assessing through all these assessments components. So out of the 5, all the 5 components are assessing this particular learning outcome. Okay, so this is how it goes, so on and so forth. So basically the idea is that it's very clear how these learning outcomes are being assessed and what are the different assessment components that are assessing these particular learning outcomes. So I think that sort of a connection is what is required at an instructor level, and this also needs to be made clear to the students that this is how you're going to be assessed. In terms of the other mapping, the assessment learning outcomes mapping, if you look at it for one particular assessment, which are the learning outcomes that are being assessed? So it's the other way around. So instead of the LHS, the left hand side becomes the right hand side. And I'm saying that A1, which is the assignment, this is the breakup of marks. Okay. Now this I did myself, so I know exactly where this, the components are coming from, because I marked them on these particular learning outcomes. Okay. For some of the things, it's not clear. Okay, because A2 being a quiz, which is, let's say, 20 questions, 5 minutes. They do it individually. I don't know, or it's not very clear how many, what is contributing to this assessment, and hence I've left this blank. Okay. A3 being class participation. Again, I do know that all of these learning outcomes are basically being assessed through this particular assessment, but I don't know the quantum of that particular thing, right? And so on and so forth. Okay. So what I find useful is a kind of an Excel that I make. Okay. So in current iteration, this is what I have here. So I do know what are the different outcomes and how to do it. So when I'm marking also, this comes in handy. Okay. So in terms of how do you assess the learning outcomes, you try to make a relationship between different learning outcomes, different assessment components, and try to link the two. Now, we do have a school level understanding that there are two levels of learning outcomes, and at a subject level, at a program level, we need to cover these learning outcomes. What is not clear exactly is how to map these. So what you're seeing here is at an individual level or not at a school level. Okay, but I'm sure through the efforts, I'm sure we'll arrive at an understanding of how to map these two, how to make a relationship between these two, so that there is something called an assurance of learning. In accreditation, it's a very common term, and the idea is that how assured you are, not only yourself, but how can you show others that you are achieving these learning outcomes. And this is the way you sort of quantify it. This is the way you tabulate it to say this is exactly what is happening in my course. Okay, and that way these guys are assured that of course the learning is happening, and then they do whatever they have to do. So I'm very to the point and clear. I think I'll just also share. I think I have a course outlines. So this is a sample course outline that is shared. Okay, this is not my course outline. What I'm trying to show here is learning goals. So please don't change the underlying goals. They are fixed for the program. Okay, so this is the blank template that we get, and these 4 learning outcomes, they are already there. Okay, so this is common for all the courses. So critical interpersonal awareness in teams, effective presentation skills. And that is mandated by organizations like AACSB or ACBSP. Okay, at a subject level, I have 4 more, and I'm trying to say that all these 8 learning outcomes, I'm trying to map through, or I'm trying to assess through these assessment criteria. So I think I'm pretty much done. I'll take questions now if you have.
So I have these questions, like one question. When a particular subject is taught by different instructors, right? So in that case, is the standardization possible with respect to assessment and learning outcomes both?
You are directing this question to Shona?
Both. Because it's about a standardization, So I think I already had an answer with him, like pending knowledge. So with respect to assessment, so if a same course is being taught by different instructors, are these possible? Is assessment the?
Well, it's certainly possible. If there is a school level understanding that something assessment components have to be same. Feasibility is not an issue. I do not know whether it's desirable or not. So desirability is more bigger an issue. So 2 different people teaching the same subject cannot have the same flavor. Okay, it will have a very, very different flavor. Especially in manual school, I'm sure it's relevant for all the schools. I'm not sure whether it's even healthy to have it exactly the same taste. Okay, you can and should standardize it to a certain extent, and to say that these are the broad learning outcomes that your course should achieve. But beyond that, I think it should be left to the instructor to give him some sort of a flexibility in order to do what he wants to do. Because pedagogy-wise, let's say I'm teaching a particular topic on resource-based view and strategy. Okay, I have 5 different ways of teaching that, and in every iteration of the course, I have a different pedagogy because I myself get bored by the same stuff. Okay, so I'm trying to experiment every class, try to make sure that can I do it better than the last time? Okay, so I think it should not be done beyond a certain point. Of course, it can be done. If the school asks that the same course outline everyone will follow, and this is I'm sure it can be done. And to a certain extent, it should be done. Like what they're doing, they're trying to standardize this particular course across the 5 sections.
At least they have a similar question paper for all the
So yeah, we have a similar end term question paper. So we have 50 marks of an end term, which all the sections need to answer this one question. But we have 50 marks of an internal assessment, which makes the 100 marks.
So internal is different?
Entirely up to the instructors.
I think that's the way.
Yeah. So we have 50
I would
marks
strongly
of
support
internal,
that. Yes.
which we do entirely by ourselves, and then we have a common intern paper. So actually, a lot of things that you were talking about, I mean, is relevant to us in sort of the internal assessment sort of paradigm, right? Because to the extent that the Bar Council also requires that the course has an exam at the end, a traditional, end term exam with a question paper and a written answer booklet. I mean, there obviously we can't do much. I mean, we can design the questions in a way to test, different learning outcomes or different question tests, a different type of understanding of the course. But over and above that, we cannot experiment with the sort of things we can. We can basically just ask questions. But these other things are quite helpful in terms of internal assessment. I would say, at least for the law school, this is. I mean, I was particularly interested, and sort of impressed also in the way that I guess business school people are just better at doing this kind of things. Mapping assessments to learning outcomes and then giving a weight. So even within the 10 marks sort of that you have said, 1, 2, 3. This is really helpful, and I'm thinking that I could definitely, take this back to my colleagues, thinking of how you really rethink your assessments by sort of pegging them to different outcomes, and the same assessment contributes 2 marks to this outcome and 3 marks to that outcome. I mean, that's a helpful way of even thinking about how you want to then grade that, and you don't put a block 7 out of 10, but you sort of grade it in a much more granular fashion. So this granular work is very helpful actually, I would say.
Thank you very much. Just 2 clarifications. A, this is at an individual level, at a school level, we don't have that sort of an understanding, except the fact that we have 2 levels of learning outcomes. Yeah. And the second is that in many cases, as you have seen, it's very difficult to quantify, how much is coming from where. It's just not possible. Yeah. So that way, it's not very clear, and hence there are certain difficulties in totally implementing this kind of rubric.
I have another thing. In one of the assessment, you showed 10 marks for group activity, and you said that every student get the same marks in that group.
Yeah.
And the third slide was so does it not jeopardize the individual skill and
which one you
referring to? A1.
Yeah.
So does it not jeopardize the individual participation and the hard work in the group?
You mean, it sort of incentivizes free riding to some extent. It absolutely does. Actually, my intent of designing it this way is to give equal proportion to group and individual. So roughly 50 from group and 50 from individual. So in some cases, free riding happens, and I think to some extent it's very difficult to check that. It's not even healthy, because in real life also we're trying to say that in almost all the cases you get credit for what you do in companies, which is obviously not the case. Okay, so in corporations and organizations, sometimes you do all the work, but the credit goes somewhere else. And in a way, we are also telling students that this is what happens here. But what I'm trying to say is, I don't find it very healthy to make it very, very rigid. And hence, in A1, of course, some of that is happening, which I'm trying to check in A4, where the quantum of marks is more. And hence, I make it a point that I question them individually, and by God, when they come for the presentation, they understand that they will be questioned.
This is quite good actually. Because free riding is not. It's a problem, but it's not the world's biggest problem actually. Free riding is not. The free rider problem is a bit overstated. I think even in economics generally, it's a bit overstated.
It's a bit overstated.
So I think it's actually quite fair, and I would think that this should actually play into our courses, in order to sort of hero individual merit. I think we actually lose out in that even if we actually give a little bit of scope for free riding, there may be that kind of assessment that we can't do ultimately. That somebody has actually learned something even out of the free riding a little bit.
Yes.
That's something that we just don't have the bandwidth to assess. So we should even leave that in the grey and say, let them do it. It's fine. There is some value to even cheating. There is some value to it. So let it be there. Obviously you want to control it to a certain extent. But a little bit of free riding is actually quite helpful, because there is that one person who out of free riding also would have learned a little bit that you will never be in a position to properly assess. So I think it's actually good to let it go, and I actually quite appreciate the idea that there are some groups in which you don't look behind the sort of corporate veil. So
I think it's a very, very good point. So, I mean, that is also, so there are multiple aspects to it. So one is obviously, what he said, that sometimes just you can't, shouldn't do it because, there is some value to free riding as well. And if the student is smart enough to realize, how to play the game, then, obviously you've got to. But the other thing is that in order to operationalize this, this mechanism to check free riding takes a lot of effort. So if I'm doing end-term presentations, let's say I'm assessing A4, it takes me approximately 8 to 10 hours for a small batch, for a batch of 100 that I taught. It took me roughly,
In one class?
but 2 sections, but the same course. So 15 one, 15 another. It took me about 20 hours. So this was all beyond the class coursework. So I was doing 6 to 12, 6 to 1 p.m. in the night. I was probably the only faculty here and I was assessing them. So they were making a VC presentation in one of my courses for venture capital firms at 12 in the night, with a tie. So it was hilarious to some. What I'm saying is this takes a lot of effort. So I can't be doing it in every component. And in addition to what he said, there are 3, 4, 5 different aspects of why you shouldn't sort of do it in every component.
Thank you.
I have first one more
Okay.
to say. In case of mode of evaluation assessment, you say there are different sit-down end-term examination and take-home examination. Right? And so I'd like to know this: how do you test the subjectivity and the objectivity? For example, the end-term question paper is quite objective. What questions you already make a key answer, right? Because there are 2 different schools, law and
I don't think even in that context, especially I'm sure that is also true in law. For one particular question, even if you have the key and the student answers completely differently with proper reasoning and logic, I think I don't give the marks. Okay, so that's just, the key is just my perspective, my take on that particular question paper. But a law can be interpreted in very different ways. Ask Ram Jetnandan.
That's why I'm asking. The subjectivity and objectivity, the criteria for evaluating this. Do you have another set of ways, methods of evaluating the subjectivity of understanding and objective answers to it?
I think to a large extent, it's within the realm of the instructor to assess it, because it can't really be. I mean, some of these components can be objective. Like if it's a business simulation, the score comes right there. It's a computer algorithm that's calculating the score. I have absolutely no say in it. It's very objective. Okay, I have a number there. But if you're talking about even the end-term paper, even though some might think that's objective, it's actually not the case. It's not completely objective because for one particular question, as I said, I can have 5 different right answers. Okay, because a business situation can be dealt in a variety of different ways, and a law can be interpreted in a variety of different ways. So even though it's kind of objective, it's not completely objective. There's a large part of subjectivity there, and which is not necessarily bad or good. It's just the way it is. If you make it completely objective, I don't think that is actually right.
Yeah.
So thank you, Mike. We are now coming to the end of this presentation. I think in the business school it's slightly different from the law school, because in the business school there is more regulation from accreditation bodies. AACSB and various other bodies, they have very specific specifications for how assessment should be done, and as you have pointed out, assurance of learning has a very big role in accreditation exercises in business schools. But again, you have demonstrated some international best practices here, but when you have a large class, the way you have described mapping it, and then you have you subdivide it into different components. Probably, as you rightly pointed out, it takes a lot of time. Yes. So how many faculty members really do that is a big question. Because sometimes I think you have to probably make a general assessment and then see how that general assessment can fit into certain parameters. Probably that's how, maybe that's my suspicion, that's how it is largely done.
I think So what we need to do at a school level going forward also, since we are targeting all these different accreditations, is at least come to a lowest common denominator in the sense that it shouldn't be very work intensive, labor intensive, but it should require small effort, and that should more or less link the learning outcomes with assessments. Okay? Not perhaps at this detail, but at a minimum a great detail so that the faculty is also not overburdened. Because it also links with the number of hours you're doing.
Of course. Yeah. Now the other question I have, I'm not too clear from your presentation, right? Because when you talk about learning outcomes and assessment on the basis of learning outcomes, when you relate these, assessment can be of two types. One is criterion-referenced assessment and the other is norm-referenced assessment. But when you implement student learning outcomes in a program, in a curriculum, then it has to be of necessity criterion-referenced assessment. Whether this is happening or not in all the schools in JGU, I'm not sure. Because
I'm not sure.
Yeah, because sometimes you follow the regulations and you may have perhaps 10% with grade A and 20% for grade B. If you are doing that, then you are not following the outcomes-based principles very rigorously. Because once you have the outcomes-based principle and you have criteria very clearly identified and rubrics, then you may have a class where everyone gets an A grade because they satisfy the criteria. Or everyone may get an F, then you all fail. But at some point in time, when you have these types of variations, a natural curve will come into existence on its own. So the need for arbitrarily defining 10% should be A, 20% should be B, or that is, it doesn't go with outcomes-based teaching and learning. I don't know what is your experience in this.
We are required to apply the curve, right? I mean, we have a loose curve requirement, which is that while we're not required to apply the curve, we're required to apply a maximum of 20% fail and a maximum of 10% or 15% of the outstanding grade. So O, and in between that, there we have A plus to C, I think, or B minus, what it is. I mean that there is no curve requirement, so there is no strict curve. But I mean, well, there are many universities, many law schools in the world which sort of automatically follow the curve, right? Or, for example, if I remember correctly, Chicago University Law School definitely follows the curve. And at Harvard, the instructor may choose to follow the curve or they may choose not to follow the curve, but there's a tendency to curve. So I don't know, Mr. Shah, if there's a contradiction between assessing based on outcomes and using the curve, because even while you are assessing based on outcomes, and everybody who delivers the outcome does not necessarily have to get an A, right? Because you can still, deliver the outcome may be delivered. You may have achieved whatever program level outcome 1, but there is still a comparative way of achievement. And so I think even internal to every assessment, linked to every outcome, so as granular as you'd like it. So even if you assign 1 point from A assessment 1 to learning outcome 1, you could still curve that and so give 1 point to somebody who's done it perfectly and half point to somebody who's done it a little bit less than perfect. So I don't think that applying the curve is necessarily contradictory to doing the sort of program, sort of outcome-based assessments. Do you think so?
I would second that. I think at the end, because the components are quite subjective. I mean, whether the presentation skills is 2 out of 2 or 1 out of 2, I mean that is also relative to a large extent, isn't it? I mean, in one particular section, I could give 2 out of 2 for one particular student, but in a much more better class, that student might get half mark. So what I'm saying is the components are still sort of relative, even in an outcome-based scenario.
Yeah, I think when you are assessing an outcomes, as you have rightly pointed out, there will be different levels of achievement. A student may have, if you are thinking of critical skills through various assessment tasks, the assessment of the students may be at different levels. one student may have done it in a very exemplary manner, another student is mediocre.
Yes.
You grade them.
Yes.
But still, if he has satisfied the criterion, then he passes. So the curve has to come in a natural way rather than an arbitrary decision of 10% or 20%. This is what I'm saying.
I mean, I get what you're saying, but I'm not entirely convinced actually. So there may be, so the school may suggest that, look, please don't think that because somebody has achieved the outcome, they have necessarily achieved it in an exemplary fashion. And that you should be a little sort of, so treat exemplary as a truly exemplary standard. In other words, naturally not more than say 10% of your students should be exemplary.
Yeah, why 10%? Why not 15%?
Yeah,
why not 9%?
Yeah, I mean, of course.
Into that.
Yeah, no, you're right. But I also don't think that every arbitrary number is an unreasonable number, and there is some difference between an arbitrary number and unreasonable. Of course, numbers are arbitrary. 18 years as the age of majority is arbitrary. 21 as a drinking limit is arbitrary. 16 years as the age of consent is arbitrary. It is arbitrary. But it's not necessarily unreasonable. So I think that there may be some reasonableness to that arbitrariness, thinking that, look, on a general sort of our understanding is that 10% of our class can be outstanding, and that not everybody else is outstanding because not everybody else in the world is coming across as outstanding. So it's fine. I mean, so I know it's arbitrary, but I don't necessarily think that all arbitrary is unreasonable. So yeah.
Well, I'm not advocating this or that.
Yeah.
I'm just pointing out that these differences exist
Sure.
even in the literature.
Sure.
So I think with that, I would like to bring to a close this presentation. Thank you very much, Mayank, for a very good presentation. And you also have implemented some international best practices. I think we had, again, a little bit of discussion about groups participating and how you assess groups in your presentation as well, and in Shanoy's presentation. So I think what happens there is that you tend to allow free riders to some extent for a certain reason, but there is also merit in peer learning. When you sit in a group, you learn through your own peers in your own group. You're learning, so that is fine. So that is again one of the things which probably that is the reality, in fact. If there are no other questions, I will go to my presentation, which is largely covered by these excellent faculty members here. But I will focus. Yeah, I will just focus on NAT requirements probably, although the number of slides are quite a number, but some of them I will go through very quickly. I will wait for Shonai to return. I hope you found this workshop useful so far, and I wish we had more participants.
Oh yes.
It's very interesting, thank you. And I want to add in my viewpoint important elements, aspects
Yes.
which we have to focus. So what I noticed from my teaching experience here, student is when they present something or express their opinion, they are not critical to their own words. So if they say them that it might be in a different way, so we just think it in a bit different manner, they just start arguing and telling that their viewpoint is very correct, right? So the main task is to broaden the viewpoint of the things that in business, in life, everything. We don't have one correct answer like in mathematics, right?
Absolutely.
We have
Yes.
formula and
Yes.
we have 2 plus 2 is equal 4. No.
Yes.
And the second one, so probably we have to focus not only on analytical or convergent thinking, but divergent teaching methods. So students apply more non-trivial ways to solving different problems. So add children they are more creative than adults, right? And when they acquire more and more knowledge, right? So they start thinking it's about analytical ways. So probably it's referring not to learning outcomes, but just to emphasize that this creative aspects, how they do it, and like certain teaching methods and techniques which we use to help them to discover and develop this creative thinking. So that
I agree with you.
helpful,
Yes.
right? Especially in business, I know
Yes.
law is all about legislation, codex, and it's very, very straightforward. But in business, it's this element of creativity is important in strategy design, in marketing, in innovation, in most of the like functional areas where students are going to work for, and like we have to apply to what labor market demands, right? Because we have problems that we can teach, we demand something, but they cannot use it in their business life. So
Thank you. Right, this is a presentation largely relating to NAC requirements. So, we can just go there. Right. We have, if you have seen the program which I circulated previously, it's not given here, but in the email which I sent, I have identified the outcomes of the workshop today. I've listed 3 outcomes of the workshop. Those are more or less like program outcomes, and the presentation outcomes here is like course outcomes. So these are some of the outcomes which I expect after this presentation, and I hope we will be able to achieve those outcomes. A few prominent features of the revised NAC criteria is introduction of the quantitative assessment of verifiable data submitted by institutions, 70%, penalties for incorrect data submitted, restricted qualitative assessment via peer team visit, the weight given to that is 30% to address criticism of subjectivity and bias, focus on student learning outcomes and student satisfaction surveys and other feedback systems. Now this is more or less taken from the NAC manual. Previously, the last exercise we had in 2016 consisted 100% of a team coming here and assessing us on the ground. But they have now changed the methodology. We are required to submit documents, and 70% of the weight will depend on verification of the documents and how it is assessed. And the remaining 30% will be by a small team coming here for a shorter duration rather than for 3 or 4 days. They will come here for a shorter duration, and 30% weight is given for a site visit. So that is a change in methodology. And under the revised criteria, the bullets in red, there is focus on student learning outcomes. I think in the previous, until the previous exercise and for many exercises elsewhere in the country, probably the auditors who came themselves didn't understand the meaning of student learning outcomes or assessment of student learning outcomes, because they were retired vice chancellors and so on in the traditional conventional mode of teaching and learning. But now they are, NAC accreditors are being coached to see what are the learning outcomes and how these learning outcomes will be assessed and so forth. I'm not sure whether you can read the words there. NAC requirements needs to examine the role of higher education institutions in preparing the student to achieve core competencies to face the global challenges successfully. These are some of the new things which they have put in the manual. Core competencies. I think in the previous manual they didn't use this terminology. Holistic development of students is the main purpose of a curriculum. Quality of assessment process in higher education institutions depends on how well the examination system actually tests the program program specific outcomes and course outcomes. Those are some of the criteria in the new NAC manual. Shonai was talking about jargon, so I have a few words here in the outcomes-based teaching and learning model. Program outcomes, or what we call graduate attributes in this university, NAC is calling them program outcomes. When they say program outcomes, collectively all the programs in an institution. So we call it graduate attributes, and graduate attributes is are the words which are used across in other countries also in many universities. And what we call program outcomes, previously NAC is calling it program specific outcomes. I think we shouldn't pay too much attention to the terminology. We can continue to use our own terminology. What is important here is that there are 5 items I've given here. The 5th bullet there is hierarchy of outcomes. I will go to that in a minute. But the next set of jargon words, teaching and learning activities, which is TLAs, assessment tasks, ATs, assessment criteria and rubrics, criterion reference versus norm reference assessment, which I just spoke about a little while ago, aims, objectives, and outcomes, outputs. Again, sometimes people get confused about what are the aims or objectives and what are the outcomes or outputs. What is an output? In terms of outcomes-based education, what is an output? Does anyone have an answer? How is outcome different from output?
Output would be what the students have actually produced through that exercise. So maybe it's an essay, or maybe it's something
Outputs
intangible.
are expected. What is expected of this course, and output is actually what came out to be.
Well, output is generally quantitative. How many students graduate? What is the research output? Those kinds of things. That is output. Learning outcomes is different. What the students have learned and are able to do after successfully completing a course of study.
Okay,
So that's the
more
difference.
intangible than output would be just numbers.
Numbers, yes, only quantitative, mainly quantitative. The other last bullet here, declarative knowledge and functional knowledge or procedural knowledge. Declarative knowledge refers to facts or information stored in the memory of the student, and he just has to explain it or describe it and bring it out from his memory. So in those kinds of outcomes, you use the words like explain, describe, and so on. Whereas functional knowledge refers to application of knowledge, where you plan, design, evaluate, demonstrate, and so on. Now the next slide is what I was referring to, hierarchy of outcomes. Where do you start? You first have the institutional outcomes, which are generally enshrined in the vision, mission of the university or the goals of the university, and then you have program outcomes. NAC calls them program outcomes, but we call them graduate attributes. You have a statement of graduate attributes, and from there you have cascading down the program specific outcomes, and you cascade down further and you have course or module outcomes. This is the hierarchy of the outcomes. Then statement of graduate attributes. What is the purpose of statement of graduate attributes? It provides a common denominator for the design and development of all program specific and course learning outcomes at an institution. So program outcomes, when we say program outcomes, if you go, I will go to the next slide straight away. This is the JGU's statement of program outcomes. I don't know how many of our faculty members really pay attention to it or even look at it. These are the documents which have been framed here and which have been put up over there. So graduate attributes is something which is like a common denominator. All programs should somehow have some elements of the graduate attributes incorporated in program outcomes. And as you go down from program outcomes to course learning outcomes should also be, you should be able to map them to program outcomes. Program outcomes you should be able to map it to graduate attributes, and so on. Now, who is the program document? Who looks at the program document? Obviously the students, so you may have a soft copy and hard copy, and as I've mentioned here, please see the template given by Shanoy as a good example of a document, of a course document. Implementing course outcomes, course aims, identify distinctive features of a program, which is very, very clearly done in Shanoy's example here. There is a difference between aims and outcomes, and I don't think I need to explain further because Shanoy has done an excellent, given us an excellent example here. But I think in the next slide I have an example there is a subject, cognitive psychology. The outcomes given here: after successful completion of this course, students should be able to explain the human mind from a cognitive approach, identify the strengths and limitations of attention theories and models in explaining cognitive functioning, explain the basis of artificial intelligence, contrast the difference between conscious and unconscious processing, conduct at least one type of cognitive psychology study. Now, when you look at these outcomes, you will see that all these outcomes have an active verb in it: explain, identify, contrast, conduct, and so on. So learning outcomes must contain active verbs rather than passive verbs. Now, you will find in the literature, there's a lot of literature and examples of learning outcomes even on the internet. You will find that some universities in their description of learning outcomes use the word understand. A student will understand so and so. Understand has been objected to by a number of writers in the field of education, because they say understand is not an active action verb, it is a passive action verb, because understand can mean different things to different people. So if you can decide what you wish to do with it. Characteristics of I go to the next slide. Characteristics of student learning outcomes. Clarity of purpose of all concerned. The outcomes clarify what is to be taught, how it will be taught, and how it will be assessed, and so on. There is focus on capacity building rather than content delivery. That is the main distinction between the traditional mode of teaching and learning and outcomes-based teaching and learning. It promotes constructive alignment. It is which means that alignment between learning outcomes and teaching and learning activities, between learning outcomes and assessment tasks. There is alignment, and when we say constructive alignment, the model of outcomes-based teaching and learning is intended to enable a student to construct his own learning, and the teacher, the faculty member, will facilitate this construction of knowledge in the minds of the students. Motivate students by providing a sense of direction, because outcomes-based teaching and learning provides a roadmap, as is visible, very clear from Shanoy's example here. Observable, and outcomes should be observable and accessible. If they are not accessible, then it cannot be a clear outcome unless you are able to assess what is an outcome. We don't know. And it helps teachers to reflect on appropriate teaching strategies and assessment tasks. Those are some of the benefits. They are not bullet points of headings taken from the syllabus. Example of course outcomes. I have another example here. On completion of the course, in the next slide, students should be able to apply their knowledge about system analysis and design methodologies, describe how systems analysis subject areas gather information. I have a number of bullet points here as course outcomes. You will see again that there is a clear use of active verbs in the outcomes used in this example. Now, designing teaching and learning activities, again, I will refer back to Shenoy's. He has given me a good example here. If you look at his document, you will see that in where he has identified the outcome, he has also identified the teaching and learning activities. So whatever is the appropriate teaching and learning activity which will facilitate the achievement of those outcomes are the ones which have been identified here by Shenoy. I don't think I need to say any more on that. And similarly, assessment tasks he has identified in the same box. What kind of assessment tasks will be suitable for the type of learning outcome you intend to assess. Alignment, I have an example myself here from another university. The outcome is explain the concept of probability and demonstrate its use in a business context. Probably this is from a business school. And the teaching and learning activity given here is lecture, tutorial, and project work. Assessment will be assessment of project work, end of semester exam. Probably Mayank may have other suggestions on how it can be assessed. Now the second outcome here is apply the appropriate statistical tool to analyze a business related problem. There may be again a lecture, tutorial, or problem based learning, and the assessment task can be role of student in PBL project or class participation and so on. So these are just some examples here. In the next slide, I have course design in the suggested student learning outcome format. There are certain components of the format which are again very clearly given in Shenoy's example here. There should be course aims or objectives which are teacher focused statements. This is what the teacher intends to teach. So these are teacher centered statements. And then course intended learning outcomes are student centered statements as to what the student is supposed to learn and what he will be able to do after he has successfully completed a course of study. And then teaching strategies, methodology are also identified in a document such as this. Assessment tasks are identified, course content or syllabus is identified, reading list is given there, and rubrics are given, criteria and rubrics are given there. So these are some of the things which must contain. Of course, the order may change. Some of them may give the course descriptions first and then the outcomes later. I've seen examples where the outcomes may be given first and course descriptions later. There can be variations of that, but these are generally the components of a document which is prepared in the outcomes-based model. Now this more or less the last slide here, NAAC criteria relating to teaching and learning. There are two important criteria in the NAAC manual. First refers to curriculum criterion, curricular aspects, the design and development of a course of study, academic flexibility within the program, curriculum enrichment, and feedback system. Now again, feedback system is something in the previous NAAC exercises we didn't pay too much attention because I think the NAAC auditors themselves didn't know how to assess feedback and the importance of feedback. But now they are bringing this in a sense to the forefront, and they want to see universities conducting surveys to collect feedback. And the other important thing here is that in the new methodology, NAAC wants universities to give the email IDs of all students of the whole university. and they are going to collect feedback on a random basis. I don't know how that will work, because when we conduct a survey, teaching and learning survey or exit survey in our university, the response rate is very, very bad, very poor. So how NAC will conduct a survey and what conclusions they will draw out of it, we don't know. So probably again, we have to take some responsibility and create a culture where students take some responsibility in responding to student surveys. In the second item here, second criterion, teaching, learning and evaluation. In many universities I have seen that the focus of a document written in the student learning outcomes format, the focus is on teaching and learning. Somehow evaluation is left out for whatever reason. I don't know whether it's because it is difficult to enumerate or to describe, whatever the reason is. So if you leave that out, you're leaving out an important component out of the whole exercise, and this is something which in accrediting bodies pay a lot of attention to. And the wordings and the bullets in the red, teaching and learning process, I've just described that. If you leave out evaluation from it, there can be questions on it. And the last two bullets, student performance and learning outcomes, as I've said, this is becoming more important. And student satisfaction survey, as I've just said, NAC is going to conduct surveys of students and they will draw their own conclusions. I'm sorry the words are not visible here because of the color font, but you all have a copy given to your printed copy. This is an example from Ryerson University in Canada. They have given good examples of matching assessment to learning outcomes, and if you have time, please go through that. The concluding remarks, outcomes-based education facilitates and enhances quality assurance in an institution because it ensures that the quality of the programs, courses and program delivery and all are taken care of in a systematic manner rather than in a haphazard manner. And implementing student learning outcomes actually is a paradigm shift, because for some universities and colleges in the country, there are people still not aware of what student learning outcomes means. It is a whole cultural change to which, of course, we are all accustomed to because we are a global university. But I think as far as India is concerned, we still have a long way to go. It requires serious effort initially to implement student learning outcomes format, but once it is implemented, it can become a matter of routine review and revising and revisiting and updating and improving on it. So it promotes transparency, orderliness and reflection on a regular basis, because as Shanar has said, there can be a yearly review. So it promotes a reflection on the part of the teachers, and in fact there is some evidence to show as well as to how the course is being conducted, how it is being delivered, so there is a lot of transparency there. And it of course involves the support and backing of senior management as well, because if the senior management doesn't pay attention to it, sometimes it just falls flat. And I've seen universities where the senior management doesn't pay attention to it, so there is lukewarm interest at other levels for implementing outcomes-based teaching and learning. Thank you. Any questions?
This is very helpful. We have to go through this.
So, can you
Yes.
tell us the way how we can implement this taxonomy, Bloom taxonomy in our teaching outcomes?
I think in the orientation presentation I had given the chart, Bloom's taxonomy and solo taxonomy, but I can send it to you again.
Oh, I mean, I have it.
You have it.
I use this example. So
Yes.
easily describe, apply, and critically analyze, but it's not exactly. So is there any standard board, like because a hierarchy or in blue, right? Taxonomy,
Yes.
so different aspects. So how
At different
we
levels,
can
yes.
have, because
Yes.
it's like the top, right? The
Sure.
most common. It can be applicable to any course, right?
It can
So
be, yes.
what the depths of how many of these elements should be like in learning outcomes, 5, 7, 10, and like probably like I don't know if there is some standard that there is a program and all the courses are made and how these outcomes are connected together.
Yes, I think there are two taxonomies I referred to. One is the solo taxonomy, which is John Biggs is the author of solo taxonomy, and Bloom's taxonomy is in the older version, for it has been there for many years. So Biggs has tried to improve on it and given a different version. And Biggs's version consists of 5 steps. It starts with the lowest level, which is understanding or comprehension. And from there, it progresses on to different levels of comprehension, analysis, and the highest step there is creativity. It comes back to creativity, how a student will be able to learn and he becomes creative and so on. So those are different levels. And in Bloom's taxonomy also there are different parameters which take you from the lowest level of outcome to the higher level of outcome. So if you want, I can circulate that as
Yeah,
well.
I have this document.
You have that
I'm
already,
interested
okay.
on to what extent we can have to put it like all the to each elements from all the levels or
No, you
just
don't need to.
how?
No, you don't need to have all the levels in one course. It depends on the nature of the course which you are teaching.
So if it's a course of first year, so it might be some general, but if it's advanced, so you can implement more sophisticated. Right?
Yes, because if you want to implement all of it,
Yeah.
the learning outcomes may be a whole list of 8 or 10 or more. I think the shorter the list, the better. Because for assessment purposes also, the shorter the level of learning outcomes, the better.
Course length and credits probably.
Yes.
Also 5 weeks. Thank you.
So if there are no other questions, thank you all very much. Thank you for your participation.